Hey everyone, James Lynch here. In today's video, I'm going to look back on the biggest surprises of 2024 in the UFC. These are not fight performances, but these are more things that happened that if you would have told me last year, I probably wouldn't have believed you. And we're going to do a top 5 list here. And at the end of this video, I want to hear some of the biggest surprises for you this past year that maybe caught your attention that you weren't expecting looking back on the year that was in the octagon. We're going to start first with UFC 300. So we knew UFC 300 was going to happen. We didn't know that it was going to be a main event caliber fight for every single fight on the card. So credit to the UFC for this one. You had Figueiredo, Garbrandt, Green Miller, Andrade Rodriguez, Moicano, Jalen Turner. We had Diego Lopez and Sadiq Youssef on that card. Kayla Harrison, Holly Holm, Aljamain Sterling, Calvin Kattar, Yuri Prochazka, Alexander Rakic. I mean, the list goes on. These were all, it was pretty incredible the UFC pulled this off and made it into such a big spectacle. And, all this without, Conor McGregor, because that was obviously the goal, was to have McGregor initially, I think, was on this card. And then obviously rumored for 303. But that was a big surprise. If you would have told me that the UFC would have put out a main event caliber fight for every single fight on the card, probably wouldn't have believed you. And the fact that the UFC does events pretty much every weekend really tied their hands behind their backs. So yeah. Very, very surprised that the UFC was able to pull this off. Kudos to them. One of the good moments of 2024. Okay, coming in at number 4. This one was very surprising at the time. A lot of people, if you look at the responses, people are like, I didn't expect this to happen. And that is, where is it? Right here. There we go. Alex Pereira, Khalil Rountree, added to UFC 307. So this came out of left field. Now let's get a little bit of context here. So obviously Pereira, defeats Jamal Hill. He defeats Yuri Prochazka. And then it looked like he was going to fight Magomed Ankalaev. And granted, they had already booked Ankalaev against Alexander Rakic. So maybe that was the more surprising part, that Ankalaev didn't get the title shot. But then they give the fight to Khalil Rountree, and Khalil Rountree was coming off a drug suspension. So that was totally out of left field. I don't think anyone had predicted that Khalil Rountree was going to be next. I think if anything, they were looking at, I don't know what names would have been in the mix, but it just didn't seem like an obvious thing to have Rountree fight for the title, especially since he was coming off the suspension. So if you read the comments here, this was 4 months ago, people saying it's random. And also feeling bad for Ankalaev, because I think a lot of people felt like he should have fought Alex Pereira at UFC 307 and not had the fight against Alexander Rakic. So that was a totally out of left field fight. It ended up being a great fight. Obviously, Rountree showed up and certainly made it in an interesting fight, as it went a little bit later than people had anticipated. But yeah, again, if you would have told me last year Khalil Rountree gets a title shot without having any fights, because he didn't have, let me just double check here. I'm pretty sure Khalil didn't have any fights in 2024 prior to him getting that shot. So that again makes it even more at a left field. It's like, I could understand if he gets like a big win and people are kind of remembering that. Yeah, his last fight was Anthony Smith in December of 2023. So again, kind of taken a bit of a surprise turn there with going with the fight with Alex Pereira and Khalil Rountree. So that was another big moment last year that was very surprising. This past year that was very surprising. Okay, coming in at number 3. Looking back now, maybe this wasn't that surprising, but back then it certainly was, and that was Kayla Harrison signing with the UFC. This was back on January 23rd of this year. They announced it because we didn't really know. I think everyone just assumed that Kayla was going to be in the PFL for a little bit longer, especially with their acquisition of Bellator. There was the big fight with her and Chris Cyborg that was supposed to happen. That was, there was talks of that when they bought Bellator. That was going to be one of the big fights, was Kayla Harrison and Chris Cyborg. And instead, Kayla leaves the PFL and comes to the UFC. And obviously, we know what happened with her this year, getting the win over Holly Holm, getting the win over Ketlin Vieira. The time we're recording this, it hasn't been announced yet, but I'm assuming they're going to do Juliana Pena and Kayla Harrison at some point soon here. That was a very bit of a surprising thing that had happened, that she got out of the contract. Again, if you would have told me, last year that Kayla Harrison was going to leave the PFL and sign with the UFC, I probably wouldn't have believed it, in the sense that there was no real indication that she was going to leave. Obviously, she took that time off after the loss, came back and fought Aspen Ladd, but I don't think anyone really thought she was going to go to the UFC this early. I think it was going to be later, like more of like an Eddie Alvarez situation or Michael Chandler, where, you fight a little bit longer for the promotion, then it's to the point where it's like, okay, we have to get this fighter over here. I don't really feel like that happened with Kayla. If Kayla had beat Larissa Pacheco in that fight, I think there'd be more reason for her to move on. But there's still that Cyborg fight. I think that's where people got very surprised by how that sort of all unfolded. Okay, Coming in at number 2, this was really surprising, and we've had some stuff that's been like this before. We've had fights like this happen before, where fights were on short notice. We had the whole Khamzat Chimaev and Kevin Holland fight, and that whole mix-up with Nate Diaz on the UFC card a few years ago. We had the James Krause and Trevin Giles fight, which took place, not that long before. But I might be wrong about this. I'm pretty sure I'm not, but we've never had a fight that a fighter took the fight on a couple hours notice. So Aaron Bronstetter with the tweet. This was back in literally the time of the fight. Dan Ige steps in for Brian Ortega to face Diego Lopez in tonight's co-main event. Ortega had a fever. They're trying to figure out how it was handled. They will fight at 165. I mean, you just don't see this in the UFC. I don't even remember any fight cards in general where this has happened, where someone stepped in on a few hours notice. I mean, that was insane. I wish I could show you guys the videos here, but you can see some of the photos here on Google Play. I mean, it was or Google Images, I should say. It was an incredible fight, all things considered. And, Danny Ige became a legend overnight for doing that. It was very, very impressive. He lives in Vegas. He was able to take the fight. And they put it together, and they ended up putting on a pretty good fight. And obviously we know how big of a year Diego Lopez had, but I mean, there was a risk for Lopez. I don't think Lopez gets enough credit for taking that fight, because he's the one who had all the momentum. He had the big knockout at UFC 300. And then he fights Dan Ige, who's not an easy fighter to take on. Dan Ige's never been finished in the UFC. So the fact that Lopez fought him on a couple hours notice, very impressive. And obviously big ups to Dan Ige, who didn't even get a training camp, a proper training camp anyways. Obviously he's in there training, but yeah, again, if you would have told me, hey, there's going to be, one of the biggest cards of the year, they're going to make a fight on 3 hours notice, I wouldn't have believed it, right? So this is what I'm saying. I'm going more with moments from this past year that were very surprising to a lot of people. So Ige and Diego Lopez certainly on that list. And coming in at number 1. So this one comes in at number 1 because of a variety of factors. And I'm going to just tell you what it is first, and then I'm going to explain my logic. And that is the BMF title fight between Max Holloway and Justin Gaethje, not only for the fact that they put this fight together, because we've seen BMF champions before. We saw Masvidal, but we haven't seen them defend their belt. So right off the bat, that was a bit surprising. Second was the fact that Max Holloway would be moving up. That's not something, I mean, Holloway's moved up before, but it was not something that I think was even really on the table. And this happened earlier in the year, right? You look at this article, it's back from January 16th. So that was super surprising that they put all this together, and the UFC got very creative. Like, we don't really see the UFC get this creative when it comes to putting fights together like this. So it was that. And then it ended up being a great fight. And I'll show you the clip here. I don't think I'll get booted off YouTube for this. We'll put the volume down. But this, again, to me, just the fact that the fight was put together, and then you had, the pointing at the ground with Holloway here, right? And they go toe to toe. And Holloway was winning this fight. And he goes out and he knocks out Justin Gaethje. Max Holloway hasn't had a knockout in a very long time. I'd have to go back and look up. I guess it would have been Korean Zombie maybe. But the fact that he knocks out Gaethje on this huge card and he wins the BMF belt, coming up a weight class, I mean, this was a huge moment for the year. So yeah, that to me was the biggest surprise this year. Not only the fight that got put together, but the fact that the fight unfolded the way it did. And with the fact that Holloway won. If you remember, Holloway going into that fight, a lot of people didn't think he was going to win. The last time he went up to lightweight, he lost against Dustin Poirier. So the fact that he moves up, he fights this guy in Gaethje, who basically had a title shot after beating Dustin Poirier, and Holloway comes up, he spoils the party, and he gets this epic moment where he points at the ground and then he knocks out Justin Gaethje. I mean, that to me was the biggest surprising moment of the year. And I know I said I wasn't going to really do performance-based stuff, but it's not just that. It's the fact that this fight even got put together and was added to this pretty historic card. So that to me was the moment of the year. Number 1, Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway earning the BMF belt. So I want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. What were your top moments, biggest surprises from this year as far as big moments? Let me know in the comments if there's anything I missed. Follow me on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, @LynchOnSports. My name is James Lynch. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.